Hello, this is Charles Scoble, your Golden Harvest Great Lakes area agronomist, and welcome back for another edition of the Golden Harvest Agronomy In Action podcast. So today is May the 29th, and across much of Michigan and northern Indiana, the bulk of the corn and soybean crop is in the ground. But in northern Ohio, there's still areas looking for a much-needed stretch of drier weather to finish planting and get caught up there. Now, on today's episode, I'm going to cover 3 practical topics. One, what I'm seeing as I travel across the territory this week. 2, a couple of early season pests showing up, primarily seed corn maggot and black cutworm. And 3, finally, we're finding some corn replant considerations out there because there are a few fields that are starting to ask that question right now. So let's go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and talk some agronomy. Now, first off, let's talk about what I am seeing across the Great Lakes area this week. I'll start with the good news. I was excited to finally be able to row the crops from the roadside in a lot of areas, and when I had the chance to get out and walk fields with our seed advisors and their customers, I was genuinely impressed with the stands I saw. In many fields, emergence has been more uniform than you'd expect, given the kind of stop-and-go planting windows we've had. And, a lot of corn and soybeans, though, they're still sitting at that VE or emergence stage. But I did find a few cornfields at V1. That, of course, means they've got that first visible collar. Now, the soybeans, they're a little behind in development, and that's kind of normal this time of the year, especially with our cooler nights we've been having. Now, I also walked some of our Golden Harvest test plots, and I'm happy to report that, boy, the new hybrids are looking as good as, if not even better than our current lineup when it comes to emergence and early vigor. It's early, but, remember, early season consistency is exactly what we want to see to put us on the road for high yields this fall. Now, if you're looking for a quick sanity check when you walk your own fields this weekend, here's 3 things that I'd probably be focusing on. One is uniform spacing. Not just how many plants, but how evenly are they distributed. If you're looking at seedling health, we want to see those firm white roots. That's just a really good sign of growth and seedling vitality. And finally, looking for any problem patterning. In other words, are there any problems? And if so, are they random or do they follow a pattern, such as, maybe manure strips or the low areas or, maybe some heavy residue zones? And of course, that last one I mentioned, that leads right into the pest conversation of today's podcast. So, this week we found seed corn maggot damage in a few southern Michigan cornfields. Now, this pest tends to show up when we have just kind of that perfect storm of conditions of cool, wet soils with that slow emergence, plus usually something attractive for egg laying like decaying organic matter. And of course, the highest risk fields are often, fields with recent manure applications or fields with green cover crop that was terminated maybe too close to planting, or, that heavy residue situations where seeds sit maybe a little longer before they emerge. So what does it look like? You'll usually see skips or missing plants that maybe don't match any type of plant or issue. When you dig the seed, they're maybe hollowed out, or you'll find that the seedling even leafed out underground due to the insect feeding on that protective sheath over the spike. Now, oftentimes you'll see a soft, rotting seed it's sometimes tempting to blame just poor seed, but, with maggot, the key is that the seed was attacked while it was sitting there just waiting on warmth. Now, management-wise, here's the honest truth. Once the damage is done, there's not much in the way of rescue treatment out there that's going to put any plants back. Yeah, really the best move is to, one, confirm the diagnosis, dig some seeds in those problem areas, two, assess the stand uniformity. And then three, decide, is this a live with it field or maybe a replant candidate? Now, for the future, the biggest management levers that we can use are, reducing that attractive egg laying environment, given a little bit more time, maybe between cover crop termination or manure incorporation and the planting date when possible, and making sure we're planting into conditions that support faster emergence. Now, next up is black cutworm, and this one really is not a surprise. About 3 weeks ago on this podcast, we talked about the heavier than normal moth trap counts that were coming out of Indiana and Ohio, and boy, those moth flights, they set the table, and now we're seeing larvae show up in southern Michigan fields. Now, this means that starting now, it's time to walk your fields for cut or wilted plants. The larvae are getting large enough to do lots of damage, especially that feeding at night. But of course, during the day, they tend to feed underground, kind of away from the sun. And this can be even worse because this is when they feed on the growing point and start killing our young corn plants out there. So, your first priority should be to check fields that had green growth this spring, like cover crops or fields with lots of weed growth prior to planting. These areas are where adult black cutworm moths chose to lay their eggs a month ago, and now they're hatched and they're grown large enough to feed on the one thing left in those fields. It's your crop. So, for a control threshold information, probably should be considering the following information from Purdue. And they say, on primary leaf feeding, control may be needed if 3 to 5% of plants show leaf feeding and 2 or more cutworm can be found per 100 plants. Now, this management guideline is based on the assumption that for each 1% of plants with leaf feeding, there's a good chance that 3 to 5% of those plants will eventually sustain damage due to that cutting or notching. So, my challenge to you this week is that if you have cornfields that were weedy or green a few weeks back, and especially if they're not protected with the AgroSure Viptera trait, make some plans to walk those fields now and over the next couple of weeks. The Viptera provides strong protection against black cutworm, but regardless of trait package, scouting is still the best way to catch surprises early because the weather, the planting, timing, and field history even can all change the risk field by field. Now, finally, let's talk corn replant. Most fields I've seen, they look really good, but, we have a few fields this year, like always, with some reduced stands from a mix of wet conditions or emergence challenges and even some pest pressure. Now, here's the key point I want to leave you with. When dealing with the question of corn replant, the first thing we need to realize is no matter what we do, replant or leave the stand, unfortunately, we've already lost. Now, we can never get back to that full yield potential of a crop that was planted on time and had excellent emergence. So once we admit to this fact that we now need to ask ourselves the next important question, and that is, how can we still get the greatest return on investment from this field? Now, interesting enough, depending on the planting date, a thinner stand can still be the most profitable stand. In fact, according to the replant reference charts, replanting back to 32,000 plants per acre in this first week of June coming up here, that's going to probably get you around 84% of your normal yields. But leaving a stand of just 20,000 plants per acre, when we look at that same chart, And if that was planted on the 1st of May, that would actually get you 83% of your normal yield. Therefore, in this case, even though, we've lost yield potential either way, you're still better off to leave the stand at 20,000 plants per acre than to replant it at this later calendar date. So when you're making that call, let's consider about 3 things. First off is population. What is the actual final stand? We got to then, too, look at uniformity. Are the plants evenly spaced, or do you have big gaps? And then 3, the calendar and the cost. Late May replanting comes with the yield penalty risk. These extra trips across the field and sometimes even some herbicide program complications. So if you want a quick and simple way, to count, of course, we like to measure that 1/1000th of an acre in a few spots and then average those results. So in 30-inch rows, that's 17 feet 5 inches, and we count the plants in that length, and then that number times 1,000 is your population. And if you're on the fence, just call your seed advisor or call me. We can walk through a quick ROI comparison with your field conditions and your planting date options because, as we know, the right decision is often different from field to field or even, sometimes on the same farm. So whatever you do, please, though, never try to just thicken up the stand when it comes to corn. We can get away with that on soybeans, but when we're talking corn, that new stand will always just be weeds to the existing poor stand that's out there. So to wrap up this week's podcast, first of all, stands across much of the region look encouraging, but keep checking uniformity and looking for patterns of any challenges in the area. 2, we're finding seed corn maggots in some southern Michigan fields, so if you do see some issues, diagnose those by digging and, let's finally focus really on that stand evaluation. Number 3, black cutworms. They're showing up right on schedule after the moth blights, so let's be scouting fields that, were green a few weeks ago, especially those that don't have the Viptera protection on them. And finally, for replant, remember, sometimes 20,000 evenly spaced plants per acre can beat actually a late replant when you run the numbers. So thanks again for tuning in to this week's Golden Harvest Agronomy in Action podcast. Stay patient, stay safe, and I'll see you in the field.